Hey everybody! It's me, Dan Moderately Anonymous MTG. Next on our Intro to cEDH series, we're going to be taking a look at one of my favorite decks for beginning players, Winota Joiner of Forces. You might like Winota if you enjoy decks that pressure life totals, attacking with creatures, or playing stacks pieces that dictate the game pacing. Winota is a 4/4 legendary human warrior for 2 red-white that says, whenever a non-human creature you control attacks, look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may put a human creature card from among them onto the battlefield tapped and attacking. It gains indestructible until the end of turn. Put the rest of the cards on the bottom of your library in any order. Winota is a stacks deck. That means a deck that seeks to disrupt and or halt our opponent's actions so that we can take over the board and win the game. Normally I would never advise a new player to play a stacks deck because generally, they're decks that require an intimate knowledge of what the cEDH meta looks like. Usually in order to pilot stacks well, you have to know what you're up against in order to know what pieces you need to stop those decks. Winota, however, circumvents that by raw power and card advantage. While there are still plenty of benefits to your mulligans and gameplay that can be informed by knowing which stacks pieces affect which strategies, Winota only asks that you can build a small board of creatures and make 4 mana to caster, meaning fewer complex decision trees when playing that can lead you to a game loss. While Winota doesn't have 0 decisions to be made, the decisions tend to be a lot easier to make when compared to most stacks decks. This combined with the sheer power of the deck lends itself to being very friendly to new pilots. The basic game plan for Winota is to find a hand that can flood the board with non-human creatures in the early game. That includes 0 mana creatures like Ornithopter or Phyrexian Walker, or non-humans that make more non-human tokens like Goblin Rabblemaster and Legion Warboss. We also want to land at least one stacks piece that can heavily affect the table we're at. Generally, the most powerful of those effects are ones like Archon of Emeria or Eidolon of Rhetoric that stop players from casting more than 1 spell per turn.
The ancient Greek pronunciation is actually...
Or an effect like Spirit of the Labyrinth that stops players from drawing cards. Some of the biggest obstacles for this deck are spot removal and board wipes. That means we want to start enacting our plan quickly and aggressively. Hands that can generate us Winota triggers before we get her on the board are the best ones that we can be looking for. And we also want to make sure that we're looking for pieces that can heavily affect our opponents. If we're facing a red deck that uses Underworld Breach, cards like Soulless Jailer or Phyrexian Revoker that can name Lion's Eye Diamond are great bets. As we said previously, cards like Archon of Emeria are all-stars in the deck. And if we're in a pod with mid-range decks, creatures that can be evasive like Ginger Brute, Phoenix Chick, or even Mind Sensor can be incredibly important to make sure that we consistently get our Winota triggers across the game. While a lot of stacks decks traditionally struggle to transition from the state of hating opponents out to taking over the board, this is where Winota shines. Just by attacking, we're cheating on both mana and card advantage by looking at the top 6 cards of our library and putting the creature directly into play. Very importantly, putting a creature onto the board this way is part of resolving Winota's trigger. That means players won't have a chance to respond between the time that you're choosing a creature and when you're putting it onto the board. For creatures with static abilities like Magus of the Moon, Grand Abolisher, once Winota's trigger is resolved, those abilities have taken effect and can't be interacted with. Importantly, the same is true for creatures who ask you to make a choice as they enter the battlefield like Rick Steadfast Leader or Sanctum Prelate. The difference is subtle but meaningful from the wording on creatures like Ranger Captain of Eos or Solitude that have enter the battlefield abilities. The easy way to remember is to look at the wording. Creatures that have you make a choice will say, as Phyrexian Revoker enters the battlefield, make a choice, instead of when. The word when is the indicator of an enter the battlefield ability. Like on Solitude that says, when Solitude enters the battlefield, X action happens. Enter the battlefield triggers go on the stack, and this is something that can be responded to. But once Prelate or Magus come down, your opponents won't have the option to try casting a 2-mana spell or cracking their fetch land. They'll have to anticipate needing to do this before your Winota trigger resolves. While our main game plan is to hate out the combo decks, Winota has her own combat-based combos to help ensure that we can close the game out in one attack step. The first combo that we have is a classic, Kiki Jiki Mirror Breaker and Zealous Conscripts. Kiki taps to make a copy of Conscripts. A token copy of Conscripts enters the battlefield, and we target Kiki Jiki with its trigger. We untap Kiki Jiki, and repeat this process for an infinite amount of hasty attackers. The other combo uses the creatures Rionya Fire Dancer and Combat Celebrant. In the beginning of the combat step, Rionya will make a copy of your Combat Celebrant with haste. The Combat Celebrant token can be exerted as it attacks to make an additional combat step after this one, and then when you enter your new combat phase, Rionya will trigger again, making a new Combat Celebrant token, which can also be exerted as it attacks. We can repeat these actions an infinite number of times until our opponents have been beaten to death in chunks of 4 damage. When looking at our opening hands, there's only one thing that we really want, and that's a coherent plan that takes us from casting non-human creatures to resolving Winota and eventually overpowering the board. Remember that using Stax pieces to slow down the table and establishing a board presence with non-human creatures is our primary concern. So while a hand that can cast Winota on turn 1 is good, it's not the best thing that we can be doing with our early turns. If you spend a Jeweled Lotus on Winota and she gets removed immediately, if you don't have the proper ramp, it's going to be difficult to recast her and take advantage of her abilities. Consistent ramp is our best bet, like Mana Crypt, Soul Ring, or our mana dorks like Ornithopter Paradise or Mirror Convert that can transition from the early game to casting Stax pieces that gum up the board, and finally into casting Winota when we've sufficiently slowed things down. Tutors and combo pieces aren't as important to find in the early game because remember, the more attackers we have for Winota, the deeper she can dig to help us find them. The best opening hands will have a low mana curve, multiple non-humans, and a plan to cast Winota. Winota is one of the most popular decks in cEDH for a reason. It's incredibly powerful, it has a straightforward game plan, it wins tournaments, and most importantly, it's not very difficult to play. Winota asks you to understand some really basic concepts of the cEDH meta and your mana curve, and Winota takes care of the rest. If you want to find out more about Winota, make sure you check out the video links in the description for deck lists, a link to the Winota Discord, or check the card above to see my episode of How to Play cEDH with comedian MTG where we talk all things Winota. I hope you enjoyed this next installment of the series. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to help directly support this content, consider joining our Patreon to get access to our private Discord, early access to videos like this, and dozens of hours of bonus content. Be good to yourselves, everyone.